From the ruins of a shattered kingdom to the glory of a reborn nation, this is the epic saga of a chosen people who faced exile, persecution, and near oblivion. Through the courts of Babylon, the palaces of Persia, and the dusty streets of a Jerusalem under Reconstruction, we'll follow unlikely heroes like Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah in their struggle to keep the faith and identity alive in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The rising sun cast long fingers of light over the rolling hills of Judea, illuminating the ruins of what was once a thriving city. Jerusalem, the crown jewel of David's kingdom, was now nothing more than an empty shell, its walls torn down and its sacred temple reduced to smoldering rubble. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional caw of a raven circling over the desolation. The fall of Jerusalem was not an isolated event, but the climax of a tragedy that unfolded over generations. The northern kingdom, Israel, had already succumbed to Assyrian might more than a century earlier. Its 10 tribes were scattered to the 4 winds, leaving only Judah as the last bastion of David's heritage. The conquest of Israel by Assyria was a devastating blow to the chosen people. Cities were razed, families were separated, and a millennia-old culture was almost erased from the face of the earth. The Assyrians, known for their brutality, implemented a policy of mass deportation, exchanging conquered populations to weaken local resistance and erase national identities. But Judah did not learn from the fate of its northern brothers. Mired in corruption, idolatry, and social injustice, the small kingdom found itself cornered between the imperial ambitions of Egypt and Babylon. Prophets like Jeremiah raised their voices in warning, but their words fell on deaf ears. When King Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylonian rule, the hammer of Nebuchadnezzar's wrath fell upon Jerusalem with devastating force. The city was besieged, its inhabitants reduced to starvation and despair. The walls that had long protected the chosen people finally gave way, and the Babylonian hordes invaded the streets like a relentless tide. Solomon's temple, the beating heart of Jewish faith, was looted and set ablaze. The flames that consumed the sanctuary seemed to symbolize the end of an era and God's apparent abandonment. Screams of agony and despair mingled with the sound of metal against stone as Babylonian soldiers systematically destroyed the city. Thousands were killed, and the survivors, the cream of Jewish society, its artisans, scribes, and leaders, were chained and forced on a long march through the desert to Babylon. Among them was a young prince named Daniel, whose eyes burned with a mixture of pain and determination as he looked for the last time at the hills of his homeland. The journey to Babylon was a physical and spiritual ordeal. The scorching desert heat, the scarcity of water and food, the weight of chains, and the uncertainty of the future tested even the strongest. Many succumbed along the way, their bodies left unburied in the merciless sands. For those who survived the march, arrival in Babylon was a culture shock. The city, with its hanging gardens and imposing ziggurats, was a world apart from the Jerusalem they knew. The streets teemed with a diversity of languages and cultures that the exiles had never experienced before. The Babylonian exile marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary sagas of survival and rebirth in human history. Torn from their land, deprived of their temple, and seemingly abandoned by their God, the exiled Jews found themselves faced with an existential dilemma. Adapt and be absorbed by the dominant culture, or fight to preserve their unique identity. On the banks of Babylon's rivers, the exiles hung their harps on the willows and wept as they remembered Zion. Psalm 137, born from this experience, poignantly captures the pain and nostalgia of the exiles. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But from the depths of this despair, a new resilience emerged. Deprived of the familiar structures of their faith, the temple, sacrifices, pilgrimages, they turned inward to the study of Torah and the practice of domestic rituals. Sabbath observance gained new importance as a marker of identity and a bond with the divine that could not be broken by geographical boundaries. It was in this crucible of adversity that Rabbinic Judaism was born, a portable form of faith that could survive and even thrive far from the promised land. Synagogues replaced the temple as centers of worship and learning. Prayer and study took the place of sacrifices as primary forms of connection with the divine. The prophets, far from falling silent, found new and powerful voices. Ezekiel, deported in the first wave of exiles, had surreal visions and enigmatic prophecies that offered hope to the desperate. His famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, gaining flesh and life, became a powerful metaphor for the national resurrection to come. Meanwhile, in Nebuchadnezzar's courts, Daniel and his companions demonstrated that it was possible to serve God faithfully even in the heart of a pagan empire. The story of Daniel in the lion's den, as well as that of his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, spread like wildfire among the exiles, igniting a flame of hope in discouraged hearts. Daniel, with his unwavering integrity and ability to interpret dreams and visions, rose to a position of influence in the Babylonian court. His presence there was not just a story of personal success, but a guarantee for the entire exiled community. Through him, the Jews had a voice and an advocate in the highest echelons of power. Life in exile was not uniformly difficult. Many Jews, following Jeremiah's advice to build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, managed to establish prosperous lives in Babylon. They became merchants, craftsmen, and even advisors in the royal court. This prosperity, however, brought its own challenges. The temptation to assimilate was strong. Babylonian religions, with their impressive gods and elaborate rituals, exerted a powerful attraction on some. Idol worship, which had been a constant stumbling block in Judah, now presented itself in even more sophisticated and seductive forms. It was in this context that the ethical monotheism of the Jews, already crystallized by the pre-exilic prophets, gained even sharper contours. Israel's identity as a holy people, set apart for God, was reinforced precisely by being in such a different and often hostile environment. The exile was also a period of intense literary and theological activity. Many scholars believe that it was during this time that large parts of what we know as the Old Testament were compiled, edited, and in some cases composed. The stories of the patriarchs, the Exodus, the conquest of the Promised Land, all these narratives gained new relevance and power in light of the exile experience. Meanwhile, in Babylon itself, a young Jewish woman named Esther was about to play a crucial role in her people's survival. Elevated to the position of queen for her extraordinary beauty, Esther found herself at the epicenter of a deadly plot against the Jews. The palace of Susa was a labyrinth of intrigue and danger, where every whispered word could mean life or death. Esther, guided by her uncle Mordecai, navigated these treacherous waters with a mixture of grace, intelligence, and iron courage. Esther's story is remarkable not only for its dramatic outcome, but for its unique literary structure. It is the only book in the Hebrew Bible where God's name is not explicitly mentioned, yet divine providence permeates every twist of the narrative, operating behind the scenes of human history. When the malevolent Haman conspired to exterminate all the Jews in the empire, Esther risked everything, her position, her safety, and her very life, to intercede with the king. Her words, "If I perish, I perish," echoed through the ages as a testimony of selfless sacrifice. The climax of Esther's story is one of the most dramatic moments in the biblical narrative. Before King Ahasuerus, she reveals her Jewish identity and exposes Haman's plot. The moment is fraught with tension. A single wrong look, a misplaced word, and all would be lost. But Esther, with a combination of charm, wisdom, and divine courage, wins the king's heart. Haman is executed, Mordecai is elevated to a position of power, and the Jews are given permission to defend themselves against their enemies. What should have been a day of destruction turns into a day of victory, celebrated to this day in the Feast of Purim. Esther's story not only saved the Jews from annihilation, but also demonstrated that even in exile, far from the Promised Land, God had not abandoned his people. It was a powerful reminder that divine providence often operates behind the scenes, through seemingly casual circumstances and unlikely people. Meanwhile, in Babylon itself, the wheels of history continued to turn. The mighty empire that had conquered Judah was about to fall before a new rising power, the Persians. On one fateful night, as King Belshazzar feasted with the sacred vessels looted from the temple in Jerusalem, the literal writing appeared on the wall. Daniel, now an elderly man respected by both Jews and Babylonians, was called to interpret the enigmatic message. His words sealed Babylon's fate. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, numbered, weighed, divided. Before the echo of his interpretation faded, the Persian troops of Cyrus the Great invaded the supposedly impregnable city. The fall of Babylon was a seismic event that reconfigured the geopolitical map of the ancient Near East. For the exiled Jews, it was a moment of hope mixed with apprehension. What would this new world power mean for their fate? Cyrus the Great proved to be a very different ruler from his predecessors. His policy of religious tolerance and respect for local cultures contrasted sharply with the assimilationist approach of the Assyrians and Babylonians. In a surprising gesture that the Jews interpreted as fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecies, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The Cyrus cylinder, an ancient clay tablet discovered by archaeologists, corroborates the biblical account. In it, Cyrus presents himself as a liberator, restoring gods and peoples to their places of origin. For the Jews, this act was not just pragmatic politics, but the fulfillment of a divine plan announced centuries earlier. News of Cyrus's decree spread like wildfire among the exiles. After 70 long years, the dream of return had finally become reality. But the initial excitement soon gave way to practical questions and emotional dilemmas. Many of the exiles had been born in Babylon. It was the only home they knew. Others had built prosperous lives and were not eager to trade them for the uncertainty of a land in ruins. The first group of returnees, led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of the Davidic lineage, and Joshua, the high priest, faced a Herculean task. Jerusalem was no longer the glorious city their fathers and grandfathers had described so fondly. It was a heap of rubble, inhabited by strangers and surrounded by hostile nations. The journey back to Judah was fraught with dangers. Bandits lurked on the roads, and the unforgiving desert took its toll. But for many, each step toward Zion was a step toward the fulfillment of an ancient dream. Tears of joy mingled with the dust of the road when they finally caught sight of Jerusalem's hills on the horizon. The work of rebuilding began amid great enthusiasm. The altar was erected, and sacrifices were reinitiated for the first time in decades. The foundations of the new temple were laid to the sound of trumpets and songs of joy. But joy was mixed with tears. The elders who remembered the glory of the first temple wept, realizing that this new structure would be a pale shadow of its predecessor. The initial enthusiasm soon gave way to discouragement. Opposition from neighboring peoples, particularly the Samaritans, who saw the return of the Jews as a threat to their status in the region, was fierce and persistent. They used physical intimidation and political maneuvering in the Persian court to try to halt the Reconstruction. Moreover, the returnees faced poor harvests and misplaced priorities. Many, focused on establishing their own homes and livelihoods, neglected the work on the temple. This led to a long period of stagnation. The temple remained unfinished, and the city walls were still in ruins, leaving Jerusalem vulnerable to attacks. It was at this critical moment that God raised up two extraordinary leaders, the prophet Haggai and the priest scribe Ezra. Haggai shook the people out of their lethargy with incisive and challenging messages. His words were like an awakening trumpet, reminding the returnees of their sacred mission and God's promises. "Is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses while this house remains in ruins?" Haggai thundered. He directly linked the people's economic difficulties to their neglect of the temple, calling them to reorder their priorities. His prophecies rekindled the people's zeal, and work on the temple resumed with renewed vigor. Working alongside Haggai was the prophet Zechariah, whose mysterious visions and messianic promises offered a long-term perspective to complement Haggai's immediate exhortations. Zechariah spoke of a future where Jerusalem would be a city of peace, to which all nations would come to worship. Ezra, in turn, arrived in Jerusalem decades later, bringing with him not only material resources but something even more precious, a deep knowledge of the law of Moses. He found a community that had lost its way, mixing with neighboring peoples and adopting pagan practices. With a broken heart but an unwavering determination, Ezra led a dramatic spiritual revival. He gathered the people, read the law aloud, and explained its meaning. The impact was immediate and profound. Men, women, and children wept as they realized how far they had strayed from God's ways. The revival led by Ezra was a crucial turning point. It not only reaffirmed Israel's unique identity as God's chosen people, but also laid the foundations for postexilic Judaism. The emphasis on Torah as the center of Jewish life, the role of scribes as interpreters of the law, and the importance of religious education, all these elements that would define Judaism for millennia to come, had their roots in Ezra's work. The issue of mixed marriages, which Ezra saw as a threat to Israel's religious and cultural purity, was particularly controversial. His radical approach of requiring men to divorce their foreign wives and send away the children of these unions is one of the most difficult passages in the Bible for modern readers. It raises complex questions about identity, inclusion, and the costs of cultural preservation. But a crucial piece was still missing in the puzzle of restoration: Jerusalem's walls. Without adequate defenses, the city remained vulnerable and unable to fully fulfill its role as the spiritual and political center of the reborn nation. Enter Nehemiah. Cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, Nehemiah held a position of trust and influence in the court. When he received disturbing news about the pitiful state of Jerusalem, his heart broke. In an act of great courage and faith, he asked the king for permission to personally lead a rebuilding effort. Nehemiah's arrival in Jerusalem marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable construction operations in ancient history. His leadership combined strategic vision, organizational skills, and deep spirituality. He began with a secret night inspection of the walls, assessing the extent of the damage and planning the reconstruction work. Facing fierce opposition from external enemies and skepticism from within the community itself, Nehemiah mobilized the people for a Herculean effort. His strategy of making each family responsible for the section of the wall closest to their house not only distributed the work efficiently, but also gave everyone a personal stake in the project's success. Work on the walls proceeded at a frantic pace, with builders working with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. The tension was palpable. At any moment, an attack could undo months of hard work. Jerusalem's enemies, led by Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite, used everything from intimidation and mockery to assassination plots to try to stop the work. But Nehemiah was more than just a skilled builder. He was an inspiring leader, a social reformer, and a man of deep faith. Confronted with the exploitation of the poor by the rich, he did not hesitate to challenge the elite to abandon unjust practices. His personal example of selflessness and integrity set a new standard of leadership. Nehemiah's faith was expressed not only in fervent prayers, but in an unwavering trust in divine protection, combined with careful planning and constant vigilance. His famous prayer, "O God, strengthen my hands," perfectly captures this synthesis of dependence on God and responsible human action. In just 52 days, an almost miraculous feat considering the circumstances, the walls were completed. The sound of the shofar echoed through the hills of Judah, announcing a new era of security and hope. The dedication of the walls was a moment of indescribable jubilation. 2 choirs marched around the walls, their songs of praise merging at the top of the city. It was as if all creation joined in the celebration. The glorious past, the accomplished present, and the promising future converging in a single transcendent moment. But Nehemiah's work did not end with the completion of the walls. Like Ezra before him, he recognized that a nation's true strength lies not in its physical defenses, but in its moral and spiritual character. Working in partnership with Ezra, he led the people in a renewal of the covenant with God. In a solemn and moving ceremony, the people committed themselves anew to follow the law of Moses, to observe the Sabbath, to support the temple, and to live as a holy community set apart for God. It was a new beginning, a chance to correct the mistakes that had led to exile. As the dust of Reconstruction settled, a new reality emerged. Post-exilic Israel was very different from the pre-exilic monarchy. There was no longer a king sitting on David's throne, nor the visible glory of God's presence in the temple. Instead, a Torah-centered community emerged, led by priests and scribes, living under the rule of foreign empires. This new reality brought its own challenges and opportunities. On one hand, the absence of political independence meant a precarious existence, always at the mercy of foreign rulers. On the other hand, the exile experience had forged a more resilient and portable identity, capable of surviving and even thriving in adverse circumstances. The post-exilic period saw the emergence of new institutions and practices that would shape Judaism for centuries to come. The synagogue, which had arisen as a necessity in exile, now became a central pillar of community life, complementing, but not replacing, the temple. The study of Torah and its application to daily life gained unprecedented importance, giving rise to a new class of scholars, the scribes and later, the rabbis. The experience of exile and return also left an indelible mark on Jewish spirituality. The concept of galut, exile, and gala, redemption, became a central theme, not only in historical terms, but also as a metaphor for the human condition and the spiritual journey. The idea that God could be present and active even in foreign lands, far from the temple, opened new dimensions in understanding the relationship between the divine and the human. As generations passed, the memory of exile and return crystallized in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people. The words of the prophets, which once seemed so distant and obscure, gained new life and relevance. Ezekiel's visions of restoration, Isaiah's promises of comfort, Jeremiah's laments and hopes, all these texts were reread and reinterpreted in light of lived experience. Psalm 137, with its poignant evocation of Babylon's rivers, became not just a reminder of a specific historical moment, but an archetype of the Jewish experience of exile and longing for redemption. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. These words would echo through the centuries, sustaining Jewish hope and identity in countless future exiles. But the return and reconstruction did not mean the end of challenges. The post-exilic community faced internal tensions and external threats. The question of identity, who exactly was Israel now, generated conflicts with the Samaritans and other groups claiming an Israelite heritage. The temptation to assimilate into dominant cultures, first Persian and then Hellenistic, was a constant concern for leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah. The prophet Malachi, the last of the prophets in the Hebrew canon, directed harsh words to a community that, just a few generations after the return, already showed signs of complacency and spiritual corruption. His prophecies about the coming of a messenger who would prepare the way for the day of the Lord cast a look toward a future not yet realized, keeping alive the flame of messianic hope. As Persian rule gave way to Hellenistic and later to Roman, the Jewish people found themselves navigating increasingly turbulent waters. The tension between preserving Israel's unique identity and adapting to the political and cultural realities of the world around them would become a recurring theme in the centuries to come. The story of exile and return, therefore, is not just a closed chapter in ancient history. It is a living narrative that continued to shape Jewish self-awareness and, by extension, had a profound impact on the traditions that derived from it, including Christianity and Islam. It is a story of loss and recovery, of despair and hope, of judgment and grace. For later generations, exile became a powerful metaphor for the human condition. The idea that we are all in some way exiled from our true home, longing for a restoration that transcends the merely physical or political, found expression in countless spiritual traditions. The reconstruction of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem became a symbol of spiritual and moral renewal. Nehemiah's words, "Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace," continue to inspire communities and individuals to rise from the ruins and rebuild their lives. The resilience demonstrated by the Jewish people during this period, their ability to maintain faith and identity even in the most adverse circumstances, to transform tragedy into an opportunity for renewal, has become a model for liberation movements and cultural renaissance worldwide. The leadership lessons exemplified by figures such as Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, combining spiritual vision with political pragmatism, personal courage with organizational skill, remain relevant for leaders in all fields of action. The post-exile period also saw the emergence of new literary forms and theological expressions that would have a lasting impact. Apocalyptic literature, with its cosmic visions and eschatological expectations, flourished during this period. The Book of Daniel, with its visions of world empires represented as beasts and its expectation of an eternal kingdom, set a pattern that would be followed by many later writings. Wisdom, as a literary genre and mode of thought, also gained prominence. Proverbs, with its emphasis on the practical application of divine wisdom to daily life, and Ecclesiastes, with its melancholic reflection on the meaning of life under the sun, offer complementary perspectives on how to live a good and meaningful life in an often confusing and unjust world. As the Jewish community spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, new questions arose: how to maintain the unity of a dispersed people, how to preserve ancestral traditions in radically different cultural environments, how to interpret ancient laws in new circumstances. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, was a response to these challenges. Initiated in the 3rd century BC in Alexandria, it made the Scriptures accessible to Hellenized Jews and eventually to the Greco-Roman world in general. This translation not only preserved the Jewish religious heritage, but also prepared it for dissemination far beyond Israel's ethnic borders. The emergence of Rabbinic Judaism, with its emphasis on the oral interpretation of the written law, was another creative response to the challenges of the diaspora. The Mishnah, and later the Talmud, with their intricate debates and detailed casuistry, provided a flexible framework for applying the law in ever-changing circumstances. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the Second Temple, though less grandiose than its predecessor, once again became the center of Jewish religious life. The annual pilgrimages, especially for the feasts of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, reinforced the bonds between the dispersed communities and the ancestral land. However, political tensions were never far from the surface. The Maccabean revolt against Seleucid rule in the 2nd century BC, celebrated in the Feast of Hanukkah, was a moment of national triumph, but also foreshadowed conflicts to come. The subsequent Hasmonean dynasty, though initially hailed as liberators, soon found itself entangled in internal disputes and compromised by corruption. The arrival of Roman rule brought new challenges and opportunities. Herod the Great, an Idumean who ruled Judea as a client of Rome, undertook a massive renovation of the temple, making it one of the wonders of the ancient world. But his reign was also marked by paranoia, brutality, and a deep alienation from popular sentiment. Tensions between the people's messianic expectations and the realities of foreign rule grew throughout the 1st century of the Common Era. Various movements and charismatic figures emerged, each offering their own vision of liberation and restoration. It was in this cauldron of frustrated expectations and fervent hopes that a young rabbi from Galilee emerged, whose teachings and actions would challenge existing structures and sow the seeds of a new faith. Jesus of Nazareth, deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition, offered a radical interpretation of the meaning of exile and redemption, of temple and Torah. His followers, convinced that in him the ancient prophecies had been fulfilled, carried his message far beyond the borders of Judea. Early Christianity, though initially a movement within Judaism, would soon expand to include Gentiles, raising new questions about identity, law, and grace. The destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. For Jews, it was a devastating blow, echoing the destruction of the First Temple centuries earlier. For Christians, it was seen as a fulfillment of Jesus' prophecies and a sign of the transition from the Old to the New Covenant. In the centuries that followed, both Judaism and Christianity would reinvent themselves, each in their own way, to face the challenges of a world without the temple. Rabbinic Judaism, centered on the synagogue and the study of Torah, would emerge as the dominant form of Jewish practice. Christianity, in turn, would spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, eventually becoming the official religion of the empire. The story of exile and return, therefore, does not end with Ezra and Nehemiah. It continues to unfold in the experiences of communities and individuals to this day. Each generation faces its own exiles, whether literal or metaphorical, and seeks its own return. In a world marked by mass displacements, ethnic and religious conflicts, and a widespread search for meaning and belonging, the lessons of this ancient narrative remain surprisingly relevant. They remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the importance of maintaining identity and values in the face of adversity, and the ever-present possibility of renewal and new beginnings. As the sun sets over the hills of Judah, casting long shadows over the rebuilt walls of Jerusalem. We can imagine Ezra or Nehemiah standing on one of the towers, contemplating the work accomplished. The temple, though smaller and less grand than its predecessor, once again stood as a beacon of hope. The streets, once silent and deserted, now pulsed with the life of a reborn community. But their eyes do not dwell only on the present. They sweep the horizon, anticipating future challenges, dreaming of possibilities not yet realized. For the story of exile and return is not just about restoring what was lost, but about reimagining and rebuilding a future that transcends the past. And so, the saga continues. The people who walk through the valley of the shadow of exile emerge into the light of a new dawn. Transformed by adversity, strengthened by faith, they are ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story. A story that, like the God of Israel himself, refuses to be confined to the limits of time and space, continuing to inspire, challenge, and transform lives to this day. As we reflect on this epic narrative of exile and return, we are invited to consider our own journeys of loss and restoration, of challenge and overcoming. What lessons can we draw from this ancient story for our lives today? Perhaps it is the reminder that, even in the darkest moments, there is always hope for rebirth. Or the understanding that our deepest identity can survive and even flourish amidst the most adverse circumstances. Or even the realization that true reconstruction begins in the heart and mind, long before it manifests in walls and buildings. The story of exile and return teaches us that genuine renewal requires more than just physical restoration. It demands an inner transformation, a recommitment to core values, and a vision that extends beyond the immediate horizon. It also reminds us that no individual is an island. The rebuilding of Jerusalem was a community effort, requiring the participation of everyone, from leaders to the humblest workers. Similarly, our own journeys of personal and collective renewal require collaboration, empathy, and a shared sense of purpose. The saga of exile and return is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for hope, even in the darkest circumstances. It is a story that reminds us that the end of one chapter is not the end of the story. That after each exile, there is the possibility of a return. After each fall, the opportunity to rise again. For those facing their own exiles today, whether they be physical displacements, personal crises, or periods of spiritual doubt, this ancient story offers not only comfort, but also a model of how to navigate through difficult times with grace, courage, and integrity. The narrative of exile and return challenges us to consider our own part in this ongoing story. What walls in our communities and in our world need to be rebuilt? What temples, whether literal or metaphorical, await restoration? And what is our role in this work of renewal and redemption? May this story continue to echo in our hearts, inspiring us to face our own exiles with courage, to seek our own restoration with hope, and to build communities of faith and purpose that can withstand the storms of life. I invite you to reflect on your own journey. Where do you find yourself in this story of exile and return? What are the walls in your life that need to be rebuilt? What are the promises of restoration that you are waiting to see fulfilled? If this story has touched your heart, if it has kindled a flame of hope in your soul, don't let this moment pass. Share this video with someone you believe needs to hear this message of hope and renewal. Leave a like so that more people can discover this transformative story. And if you wish to delve deeper into this and other narratives that can enrich your spiritual journey, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel. Each week, we explore together the depths of ancient wisdom and its surprising relevance to our modern lives. Finally, if you're ready to take the next step in your spiritual journey, click on the card that's appearing on the screen now. There you'll find additional resources, in-depth studies, and a community of seekers like you, all united by the desire to grow, learn, and transform. Just as the people of Israel emerged from exile stronger and wiser, you too can emerge from your challenges with new strength and new purpose. The story isn't over. In fact, your next chapter is just beginning. And what an incredible chapter it can be. Until our next meeting, may you find strength to rebuild, courage to persevere, and faith to believe that the best is yet to come. Shalom, and may peace be with you on your journey. Amen.